Assalamualaikum everyone. Can everyone hear me? Sisters at the back, can you hear me? Yeah. Oh, good. Good. So we are very near the end. We have this week and one more week. Next week we will be covering, inshallah, the Prophet ﷺ in his last couple of months. Personally, for me, every time I do that last talk, it's incredibly difficult for me. The reason is, when you do the Seerah and you prepare for it, you're almost like you're becoming friends with the Sahaba and the Prophet again. You get to, in your mind at least, you get to live with them and walk with them. And when it comes to an end, it's almost like you're saying goodbye to a friend you've known for so long. I hope this is the same for those of you who have been following this either in the mosque or on YouTube. But before we get to that, we have one more week to cover. And this week doesn't cover a lot of huge events, but they do cover fairly significant events, and it's significant for our lives. So, last week we did, anyone remember? Who was here? What did we cover last week? It's a big thing. The conquest of Mecca. The conquest of Mecca, where the Muslims finally take over Mecca with 10,000 soldiers, but there is no bloodshed. And I said that the Prophet ﷺ was very merciful to the people of Mecca, who, even though they were idol worshippers, but he was incredibly tough towards the idols. He showed no mercy to the idols. He destroyed every single idol. He sent out Sahaba to destroy everything. But the people who were worshipping the idols, he was merciful to. And I guess for me, the lesson from that is that as Muslims, we hate the sin, but we should not hate the sinner. And we need to draw a clear distinction between the two. And this is the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. Now, where we start off now is that in the east of Mecca, there was a strong, very strong tribe called the Hawazin. Anyone know why this tribe is? Does it ring a bell? Hawazin. If you do, I'll be very, very impressed. No. Hawazin. Think way back to when we first started the Seerah. Almost in the second or third week. Very unique tribe. And the Prophet has close connections with this tribe.
Is it the tribe of the witness?
Yes. Halima and Harith, who fostered the Prophet ﷺ, the witness of Prophet ﷺ, they are from the Hawazin tribe. Now, when I said last week, when the army was heading towards Mecca, it was kept a top secret. No one knew they were going there. And a lot of people thought that the Prophet ﷺ was heading towards Taif, to conquer Taif. And so the people of Taif, whether he knew the Muslims that would come from there would be great, or whether it was just his nature and his mercy, I don't know, the book doesn't say. But it's the second time he refuses to curse them. Not only that, the 6,000 captives that he has, he gives them all new clothes. He gives them all new clothes. And then, amongst the Quraysh that who just newly became Muslim, he gives Abu Sufyan 100 camels, and each of his sons he gives 100 camels. There is one person, one of the prominent people of Quraysh, Safwan ibn Umayr. He's not a Muslim yet, but he's in the army with the Prophet ﷺ. So the people of Mecca are now with the Medinas. He's riding along with the Prophet ﷺ, and they are inspecting all the spoils they've gathered, and Safwan has never seen this much wealth in his life. When the Prophet ﷺ sees that Safwan is impressed by him, he gives him a large number of sheep and a large number of camels. This act, all this time, the Prophet ﷺ has done miracles. He's shown his generosity, his character, his love, everything. Yet Safwan remains not becoming a Muslim. He's one of the last people to hold out. But this act, this one act of generosity melts his heart. And he says, I'm going to be Muslim. And he says the Shahada. Finally, he says the Shahada. Now, there is talk amongst Orientalists. Some say that the Prophet ﷺ bought their allegiance, bought them, bribed them to become Muslim. This is obviously very ridiculous, because if that was the case, the Prophet ﷺ had opportunities to do that many times over. But what he knew is he knew the hearts of the people. For some people to come to Islam, it had to be his character, or the character of the Sahaba. For some people, it had to be the Quran. For some people, it had to be actually witnessing miracles. But for some people, their hearts were connected to wealth. And seeing the generosity of a person that they were not used to, that sort of generosity they weren't used to, that's what brought them to Islam. But just like in modern times it may cause people to question, it caused the Muslims also to question. The 400 Ansar who were in the army, they weren't very happy with this. They were like, we've been fighting with you throughout. We gave the Muhajirun a place to live. We looked after you. We did all this. And you're giving these Quraysh who just became Muslims yesterday all this wealth, just handing it over? This isn't right. This doesn't sit right with us. So they sent Sa'd ibn Ubadah to bring this to the Prophet's attention. The Prophet hears this and he says, gather the Ansar, let me talk to them. So he gathers the Ansar, and in my opinion, it is one of the most beautiful talks that any man has given, in my opinion. And I'll read it to you. He says, I have been told that you are angry with me. Imagine that, like the Prophet is saying, I've been told you're angry with me. You'd think he would be like, how dare you? You have no right to be angry at the Prophet. But he does. He says, I've been told you're angry with me. Didn't I come to you when you were astray and Allah guided you? You were poor and Allah gave you wealth. Weren't you forced and Allah made you love one another? But then this is my says, but by Allah, you might have answered and answered truly, for I would have testified to its truth myself. You would have said, you came to us bellied and rejected, and we accepted you. You came to us helpless, and we helped you. And you were a fugitive, and we took you in, and you were poor, and we comforted you. He's saying, I did this, I helped you. But if you might be able to reply to me by saying, yeah, we helped you too, and that is also true. I also came and you helped me. So he's kind of saying, I was there for you, but I accept you were there for me as well. You help us. Do you feel anxious for the things of this world? Wherewith I have sought to incline these people unto the faith in which you are already established? Are you not satisfied, O group of helpless, that the people go with camels and cows, while you go with the messenger of Allah to your dwellings? By in him whose hand is established? Are you not satisfied, O group of helpers, that the people go with camels and cows, while you go with the messenger of Allah to your dwellings? By in him whose hand is my life, had there been no migration, I would have been one of the Ansar. And if the people would go through a valley and a passage, and the Ansar go through another valley and passage, I would go through that valley and passage with the Ansar. Allah have mercy on the Ansar, their children, and their children's children. So, I don't know about you, but if I was one of the Ansar and I heard the Prophet say that to me, I would be like, stuff the cows and the cattle, I'm happy. And that's what happened. The Ansar, they say when they looked up, there was not one man who had a dry face. They were all crying because they understood that the Quraysh, what they had was cows and cattle and camels, but they missed out on all the many years that they had with the Prophet, the Ansar had with the Prophet. And they're going to miss out on all the many years the Ansar are going to have with the Prophet because the Prophet is saying, I will go back to you. You have the Prophet, they have cattle and camels. And they reply to the Prophet and says, yes, we are satisfied, O Prophet of Allah, with our lot and our share. So like, if that is what is for us, if the Prophet is for us, then that is an amazing share for us. We're happy with that. I think that in that speech in itself, it's not only that it's beautiful, but it lacks any arrogance. It lacks any pride when the Prophet said, I helped you, but I accept you helped me. And therefore, I'm with you. We're connected. We will always be connected. Again, I can't emphasize how I think that's one of the best speeches I've ever heard anyone give. Just then, a delegation from the Hawazin arrives. And amongst that delegation is the brother of the Prophet ﷺ's foster father, Harith, so his foster uncle. He requests to see the Prophet ﷺ, and he asks that the captives of the Sa'd ibn Bakr. So Sa'd ibn Bakr was a clan within the Hawazin tribe, and that was the clan that Halima and Harith were part of. So the Prophet ﷺ, he asked as a favor, said, please release the people of that clan and everyone that those people are related to. Now, indirectly, what he's saying is then pretty much release all the Hawazin, because the Hawazin are all related to that clan in one way or the other. And the Prophet ﷺ says yes. And he releases all the captives without any ransom. Imagine the wealth he would have got if he ransomed 6,000 people. But he says, I release them all for the sake of Halima and Harith. For the fact that these two people raised me when I was a child, he releases all of them. Prophet ﷺ then sends word to Malik ibn Auf, remember the 30-year-old general, and he says that he and his family are forgiven and his property will be returned to him. Malik accepts Islam and he says, I will lead the soldiers against those who are not Muslim yet. He says, I will now fight for you. So there's a Tariq Ramadan is interesting. He talks about this. He says, was the Prophet correcting in trusting Malik ibn Auf? He had only embraced Islam when the Prophet showed him incredible trust. He placed him in command of all the Hawazin who had already become Muslims and then ordered them to go to Taif and put an end to the Banu Taqif's resistance. The following days and years confirmed his intuition. Malik not only successfully carried out his mission, but also remained faithful and deeply spiritual in his commitment to Islam. So this was just literally a day after he becomes Muslim. The Prophet ﷺ says, I trust you. And that trust is repaid. Now before the Prophet ﷺ returns to Medina, he does Umrah. He goes back to Mecca and he does Umrah. And a Sahaba from Taif by the name of Urwa ibn Masud comes to the Prophet ﷺ and he says, we weren't able to take Taif, so let me go and convince them. Let me go and tell them about Islam and bring them to Islam. The Prophet says no. It's interesting, remember if in the Seerah there were other instances where the Prophet ﷺ actually tells them to go back to your people? Anyone can give an example of that? There was? I can't remember. The one I remember was the King of Kerala. The King of Kerala. Really? I'll send you a link. The King of Kerala who saw the moon splitting. He wanted to live with the Prophet and he said, no, you go back. But in this case, he says, no, don't go back. They will hurt you. Stay with me. But Urwa keeps insisting. And so the Prophet ﷺ gives him permission. And later news comes that the people of Taif killed him. So you see, the people of Taif aren't the most nicest people. They stoned the Prophet. They besieged, they refused to accept Islam when everyone else was accepting Islam. Now they killed one of their own people for telling them about Islam. But when the Prophet ﷺ hears this news, he says, Urwa is like the man in Yasin who summoned his people to Allah and they slew him. So what he's referring to is Surah Yasin, verses 20 to 27, if you're making note. Have a read of that when you get home. So when the Prophet ﷺ returns to Medina, he hears good news, which is Maria has given birth. Remember I said last week she was pregnant, has given birth to a son, Ibrahim. During the next several months, the Prophet ﷺ sends 16 expeditions to confront remaining hostile tribes and to destroy the idol worshipping sites. At this time, the Prophet also hears of a death. Anyone know whose death this was? One of my favorite characters, if you know who it is. I've always... No, not in Medina. Yes, Negus, the Najashi. News comes to the Prophet ﷺ, the Najashi has passed away. So he gathers all the Sahaba and he says, this day a righteous man has died. Therefore get up and pray for your brother Ashama. His name was Ashama. What status? That the Prophet ﷺ is saying, he is your brother, even though he's not here and he's never seen me. Pray for him. And this is how the Prophet ﷺ leads janazah for Negus. And this is where we get the ruling that you can pray janazah even though you're not in the vicinity of the person who's passed away. I don't know. The book says he heard. It didn't talk about Jibril, so maybe, but yeah, no. Shortly after Hunain, something else, a big event happens in the political scene. Any idea? The Persians are defeated. Up till this point, Jerusalem was under the control of the Persian Empire, sometimes directly, sometimes through proxy. At this time, the Byzantines defeat the Persians and take over Jerusalem. This fulfills Surah Rum, verses 2 to 6. So you have a read of that. When news reaches that Persia is now out of the way, it also comes that the Byzantines are now focusing their attention on the Muslims. Because at the Battle of Mu'atta, remember, Battle of Mu'atta? They weren't defeated, but the Muslim army escaped from being defeated quite significantly. Huge difference in the army. They were 100,000 and was it 3,000? I can't remember now. It was a small army.
This is a Hijri, Hijri year?
I'm not sure. I have to check the exact year. This was before the conquest of Mecca. So we covered this 2 weeks ago, before the conquest. In the Battle of Mu'atta, it showed the Byzantines that the Muslims, these Arabs, these Bedouins who didn't have anything a few years ago, is actually able to fight, and not only fight, but strategically escape a massive army. So this troubles them, and they decide that now that we've gotten rid of the Persians, we're going to go and get the Muslims. The reports say that the Byzantine army was 100,000, massive army for that time. The Prophet ﷺ gathers one of the largest armies to date. He gathers 30,000 people. But a large portion of the hypocrites refuse to join. They'll come up with a lot of excuses. And the reason for this is this. The Arabs, in their wildest dreams, would never have thought of going against the Byzantines. It was not in their frame of reference. It was the equivalent of, for example, the Haitians thinking about invading America. It's actually outrageous. Only somebody who has absolute certainty with the Lord could do this. It is an outrageous thing to do, and the hypocrites knew it was outrageous.
This is the Battle of the Bridge?
Tabuk. We're getting to Tabuk. What is happening is, I don't know, where are you from? For us, from Sri Lanka. Imagine Sri Lanka saying, yep, we're going to go fight America. That's what we're going to do. It's the same situation here. Byzantine has literally defeated, there was two great superpowers, Persia and Byzantine. Let's say, I don't know, China, America, Russia, America. Imagine America defeats China or Russia. And then suddenly Sri Lanka gets up and says, we're going to go fight America. This is what's happening. It's outrageous. It doesn't make any sense. This is why the hypocrites are like, we're not getting involved. No, we're not going. Then they come up with excuses. But 30,000 Sahaba prepare to go to war against 100,000 Byzantine soldiers. The funding of this expedition was done by many Sahaba, but at the front was Omar, who gives half his wealth, Uthman, who purchases provision for 10,000 soldiers, and Abu Bakr, who gives all his wealth. Everything he has, he gives for this. Abu Bakr is put in charge of the expedition, so he is to lead it. But he decides to leave, the Prophet ﷺ decides to leave Ali back in Medina. Despite the fact that Ali is one of the best fighters and his strength, he decides to leave Ali back in Medina. When Ali hears this, he's not happy. So he writes out to the Prophet and goes to talk to him. The Prophet's response is, would it not suffice you to be my successor in the way that Harun was to Musa, but no prophet will succeed me? Now this is one thing that the Shiites would quote as to saying that the Prophet ﷺ left Ali in its place. But Sunni scholars say, well, true, but then he also put Abu Bakr in charge of the entire army. He gave the flag to Abu Bakr, which is generally a sign of leadership and of succession. But then he also told Ali to stay in city and look after. So
He never left any clear indication
no,
as to who.
there never was.
He was a prophet. Not
Yeah,
to do it.
yeah, so that's right. So on the way, the Prophet ﷺ gets late. So on the way, the army is marching, and the Prophet ﷺ, they rest, they set up camp, and in the morning, they're all gathered to pray Fajr. Now this is very important. This is very important for next week, and I'll tell you why in a second. And all the Sahaba are waiting to pray Fajr. Fajr time has come, and it's starting to go, and they're getting restless. The Prophet's not there. They're waiting and they're waiting. And finally, Abdurrahman ibn Auf, famous Sahaba. If you don't know about Abdurrahman ibn Auf, please look him up. Famous Sahaba. He says, we can't wait anymore. It's almost time. Fajr time has gone. So he gets up and he leads the prayer. And the Sahaba are now praying behind him. When the Prophet ﷺ arrives, he arrives and he joins the congregation and prays behind Abdurrahman ibn Auf. Abdurrahman's not comfortable now. He's like, the Prophet prayed behind me. That doesn't feel right. But the Prophet tells him, you have done well. For a prophet does not die until he has been led in prayer by a pious man of his people. This is the first sign that we are getting that the prophet is now coming to terms with the fact that he is going to leave. Next week, inshallah, we will see many signs of where he is telling the Sahaba and he's comforting them. But this is the first time that the Sahaba, and in the Seerah, we hear him mention his death. On the way, they pass Al-Hijr. And Al-Hijr, anyone know where Al-Hijr is? Where the people of Saleh. The people of Saleh lived in that area. And they...
Madin Salih.
Yeah, the people of Saleh, the Prophet Saleh. So they passed the area, the city, and they passed the ruins. And these ruins, they say, was carved into the rock. And the Prophet ﷺ becomes very uncomfortable, and he says to the army, we need to make haste. We should not spend time in this area. And they move through it as fast as they can. Finally, the army reaches the outskirts of the city of Tabuk. But there is no Byzantine army. They're waiting and waiting. They wait for 20 days, and no army appears. The Prophet also makes alliances with the neighboring Arab and Jewish tribes, and then they began a consultation. The Prophet calls the Sahaba, and they discuss, should we go back or should we go further north and try and find this army? Now, in regards to consultation, we had a bit of a chat about this. It was a very interesting balance that the Sahaba had to do. When the Prophet ﷺ said something, you would imagine they would jump at it. And normally they would, if they felt that was from divine revelation. But if they felt it was the Prophet's own opinion, then they would talk to him and say, is this your opinion or is it divine revelation? Anyone have an example of that? Previously in the Seerah where this happened? Badr. At the Battle of Badr, the Prophet says, let's set up camp in front of the wells of Badr. And one of the Sahaba, I can't remember his name, says, is this Wahi or is this your opinion? And he says, this is my opinion. And he says, then can I suggest we set up camp so the wells are behind us, so that we have water, but the Quraysh don't have water. Similar in this situation. At this point, the Prophet ﷺ asks his inner sanctum, or in his inner circle, should we keep going and take over Syria? This is a man who has been promised by Allah to have Syria. He knows it is his. So he is saying, should we do it now? And Omar says, O Messenger of Allah, is this revelation or opinion? Again, they are not questioning revelation, but they are questioning the personal opinion. And the Prophet ﷺ said, it is my opinion. Then they said, let's go back to Medina. When we get stronger, we'll come back. And Omar will do the job. The point is, the Prophet ﷺ is a man in complete state of yaqeen, certainty. He has no doubts whatsoever, and his history testifies that his certainty was justifiable and correct. Tabuk is an act of deep faith. These people had extraordinary iman to go out and with absolute certainty and belief think that they were doing something intelligent and possible. The Prophet ﷺ, through iman, was making what was impossible to the materialist possible to the spiritualist. This is one of the greatest gifts of the Messenger of Allah. He made the impossible possible. Tabuk is making the impossible possible. That's why Tabuk is so important for us to remember. Despite incredible odds, we have to believe in the promise of our Prophet ﷺ. So Tabuk there was no battle in Tabuk. But it was a clear indication that 20 years ago, a group of Arab Bedouins who were fighting amongst each other and had their own gods and had no unity is now able to muster a force that is confident enough to take on a superpower. So, based on the consultation, they decide they're going to go back. So the soldiers turn around and they march back. On their way back, something happens. Anyone knows what happens? There is a plan by the hypocrites to assassinate the Prophet. Can you imagine that? Like, we've gone through the Seerah and all that, and they've gone to Tabuk, and there's still people wanting to assassinate the Prophet ﷺ. And this is revealed. Revelation comes down to reveal this. And it's revealed in Surah Tawbah, verses 73 to 74. Now the Prophet, the plan is foiled because the Prophet is made aware, and the Prophet actually knows who it is, but he doesn't reveal who it is to the Sahaba. It's incredible. He keeps it to himself. Finally, the army returns to Medina, but they are greeted with a very sad piece of information. Anyone know what happened? Someone died. No, not yet. It is Kulthum. Kulthum, his daughter, has passed away. It's history repeating itself. Remember when the Prophet ﷺ went to Badr and he came back, his daughter had died? Same thing has happened. The Prophet comes back and he's greeted with the death of his beloved daughter, Kulthum. And in Badr, it was his daughter Ruqayya who had died. The Prophet tells Uthman to comfort Uthman. So he is distraught. His daughter's died, but he's trying to comfort Uthman, who was Kulthum's husband. He says, Uthman, if I had a third daughter, I would marry her to you as well. Because he married Ruqayya and now Kulthum. Now, the hypocrites who didn't want to take part in the expedition, they come to the Prophet ﷺ and they give him excuses. Imagine this, your daughter's passed away, you've come back from a long battle and you have to sit and now listen to excuses from people. It is a mental strain. Now, if you followed the Seerah, you would know the Prophet ﷺ endured immense physical strain, but immense mental strain. And remember, he's not young now. He's not young. He's getting into his elder years, and he's grieving for the daughter, and he's having to listen to fake excuses that he knows is fake. But he puts on a brave face, he listens to it, and guess what he does? He pardons them. He doesn't even punish them, he pardons them. 3 companions, however, come to the Prophet ﷺ. 2 of them explain why they couldn't, but the third, Ka'b ibn Malik, he remains quiet. The Prophet does, however, I don't want to use the word punish, but does reprimand these 3 Sahaba. He gives an order that no Muslim, none of the Sahaba are allowed to talk to these 3 Sahaba until Allah Himself judges them. Either passes them or gives them a punishment. It takes 50 days. 50 days, and Surah Tawbah verse 118 is revealed, which then pardons the Sahaba, and it's only after that that the Sahaba are allowed to talk to these 3 people. Sheikh Hamza Yusuf has an interesting thing about why Ka'b ibn Malik didn't explain himself, why he remained quiet. He says this: the lesson for us people who aspire to be like these believers is don't offer excuses. Allah will defend those who believe. You don't need to defend yourself. The Arabs say the excuse is uglier than the original wrong. Don't offer excuse. A man knows his soul. Even if he throws out all his excuses, he knows that I am inexcusable. The hypocrite is one who defends himself. The best expression of this is an event that took place with Abu Bakr when he was in a sitting area with the Prophet ﷺ. And somebody came in and began to accuse Abu Bakr of things that Abu Bakr was not guilty of. Abu Bakr sat very patiently listening, but finally the man said something that was so troubling to Abu Bakr that he could no longer contain himself, and he defended himself. Prior to that, the Prophet ﷺ had been sitting and smiling as he was hearing these things being said about Abu Bakr. But when Abu Bakr defended himself, the Prophet ﷺ frowned and walked out. Abu Bakr went after him and asked him, "Why is it that you sat there smiling when this man was saying obvious lies about me, and yet when I defended myself, you got up and left?" He said, "O Abu Bakr, when you were silent, I saw the angels defending you. But the moment you began to defend yourself, they dispersed, and shaitan came into the room. And a prophet and shaitan cannot sit in the same room." It's amazing, isn't it? I love these things where the Prophet ﷺ sees things that we do not expect. We would interpret that completely differently. There's another beautiful example of once Prophet ﷺ sitting, and Hassan and Hussein are wrestling, right? They were young boys, they're wrestling. And the Prophet is cheering Hassan. You go, Hassan, you can do it. And Abu Bakr comes and says, "That's not fair. Why are you cheering the older one? He's stronger, he's bigger." And he says, "Abu Bakr, if you could see what I see, I'm cheering Hassan because Jibreel is cheering Hussein." So there's these little stories that are so beautiful, but this is one of those. Now, another incident happened before they left to Tabuk. Before the Prophet ﷺ left to Tabuk, he gets a message from a group of people saying that they built a mosque in Kuba. And he says, can you come and bless it? Can you come and pray in it? And the Prophet didn't have time because he was getting ready for the expedition. He said, once I return, I will come. However, when he returned, Surah Tawbah verses 107 and 108 is revealed. Anyone know about this? That's right. It was the mosque built by the hypocrites, the munafiq. And this surah actually comes and says, do not go there. Do not go there. This mosque was built for the sole purpose of causing fitna, of causing mischief, of dividing you. And when the Prophet ﷺ hears this, he orders the Sahaba to go and destroy the mosque. So in Kuba, there were two mosques. There was one mosque, it was one of the first mosques that were built, where when the Prophet ﷺ was entering Medina with Abu Bakr, he rested there. And at that point, they built the first mosque, Kuba. That is considered a blessed mosque. The hypocrites tried to build a second mosque, and the revelation came, you have to destroy it. If you don't know the Seerah, you'd be surprised to think that the Prophet ﷺ ordered the destruction of a mosque. But that actually happened. Because it's not in the building that is the importance. It is in the hearts of the people who built that mosque. It is in the hearts of the people who pray at that mosque. That is where the importance comes. If the building in itself was holy, then what's a mosque is a mosque, he wouldn't have destroyed it. But he says, no, this is not a good place. And he orders the Sahaba to destroy this mosque. Shortly after, another individual falls ill and dies. Anyone know who this one is? Abdullah ibn Ubay. You see a common theme? Hypocrisy. We're kind of covering a lot about hypocrisy. Abdullah ibn Ubay, the chief of the hypocrites, he gets ill. Now, here there is a differing opinion among scholars, because Surah Tawbah informs the Prophet ﷺ never to pray for the hypocrites. When Abdullah ibn Ubay dies, however, the Prophet ﷺ does lead the funeral prayer. Some scholars say that this verse was revealed after that, telling him not to ever do it again. But some scholars say, no, but this surah was revealed before that. So then how does it explain that the Prophet ﷺ led the janazah for Abdullah ibn Ubay? On behalf, because his son was a pious Muslim. So was it because of it? But then again, that's hard to say when this surah was very clear saying do not do it. Martin Ling seems to indicate that it might have been that Abdullah ibn Ubay had a true repentance last minute. Perhaps, if you take that version. If you take the other scholarly version, that it was revealed after that, then that makes sense. So Allahu Alam, I don't know.
The list of munafiqs was names that were revealed to the Prophet. That was said this time or after?
This, I believe, was when the assassination was happening, where he knew but he chose not to tell the Sahaba, because revelation came to spoil that assassination. I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it was then. So now we are 22 years after first revelation comes. If you're old enough, try to remember what you were doing 22 years ago, and you can kind of think about how long this seerah has been going for. 22 years since the first revelation came. And it is the month of Dhul Hijjah, and the Prophet ﷺ tells the Muslims to perform their first Hajj. And he asks Abu Bakr to lead it. Now, do you see what I mean? As much as there are hadith about the love the Prophet ﷺ had for Ali and gave him leadership positions, there are almost as equal amounts of narrations of Abu Bakr getting leadership positions. In the Battle of Tabuk and leading the Hajj now. For the first Hajj, he says Abu Bakr to lead it. 22 years after Revelations. We'll have to do a backward calculation. So the pilgrims set out, but soon as they set out, Surah At-Tawbah verse 28 is revealed. And it goes like this. All you who believe, the idol worshippers are impure. So don't let them come near the sacred mosque after this year of theirs has passed. If you're afraid of becoming poor on account of financial loss that this ban might cause, then God will enrich you. His will from His own bounty. For Allah is full of knowledge and wisdom. Do you know what is happening? You know how I said after the conquest of Mecca, the Prophet ﷺ was kind and merciful to the idol worshippers. Suddenly, this message comes saying, no more idol worshipping. You've had your time, you had your buffer zone to change, enough now. Mecca is no longer going to be a place for any sort of idol worshipping. So the Prophet ﷺ sends Ali with this, and he says, go tell this revelation to Abu Bakr and the pilgrims who are heading there, and tell them that they have 4 months. After the 4 months, the Prophet is not under obligation to protect them. That's significant. The Prophet ﷺ was merciful to the idol worshippers in the first part, and they gave him a chance and gave them a period. But then revelation came and said, time's up now. You have 4 months to make a decision whether you will become Muslim or vacate. What's that? That's right. That's right. See, Orientalists would say, oh, look, this revelation came and it was so unjust. Remember, chronologically, this revelation came after the conquest, several years after the conquest, and even then after the revelation came, there was 4 months given. It was, everything the Prophet ﷺ did was done with kindness and fairness.
Now in Bahrain, they're building up a Hindu temple now. You see that?
I don't know how to comment on that. All I can say is there's revelation that came, but I mean, I suppose the scholars there say that the revelation is very specific to Mecca because it's talking about the sacred mosque, so that Mecca cannot share worshipping Allah and worshipping idols. Those two things will not happen in Mecca.
But
So,
the Holy Land doesn't extend.
that's a question for a scholar. I don't know. Now, the Prophet ﷺ, by the age of 62, has buried 5 of his 6 children from Khadija. 5. If you have children, you know the pain. Like I don't even want to imagine that. He's buried 5. Fatima gives birth to a daughter, Zainab. And Zainab was named after the child's aunt, the eldest daughter, Zainab. But at the same time, so while this happiness is happening, at the same time, Ibrahim, his son through Maria, passes away. I'm going to read to you a description of what happens when Ibrahim passes away. Although the Prophet previously forbade loud lamentations over the departed, the tragic news brings him to tears. Abdurrahman ibn Auf sees the Prophet weeping for his son and questions the seemingly unrestrained display of emotion. Does that tell you something? The Prophet here is weeping. He's not just crying. He is heartbroken, absolutely heartbroken. And the Prophet says, it's not this that I forbid. These are promptings of tenderness and mercy. And he that is merciful, unto him shall no mercy be shown? O Ibrahim, if it were not that the promise of reunion is sure, and that this path which all must tread, and that the last of us shall overtake the first, verily we should grieve for you, O Ibrahim. The eye weeps and the heart grieves. No, say we ought that we should offend the Lord. What he's saying, it's not, when that statement of saying you shouldn't scream and shout and beat your chest came, it's not in regards to weeping as this. And you can see the pain. He's actually talking to his son saying, oh Ibrahim, if it wasn't for the fact that I know I will meet you again, how I would grieve for you. It's really heartbreaking, the pain the Prophet ﷺ is going through. But there's another interesting thing in this example. If you were to look at a hadith, for example, like from one of the Sahih books, right, and you just read the part where the Prophet ﷺ said, do not lament when someone cries, do not beat your chest and weep, you would take that as solid fact. That is it, what it is. And in my opinion, this is a perfect example of why scholarship is so important, why scholars are important. Because imagine someone who's just read that hadith and they see the Prophet weeping, they'll be saying, oh, A'udhu billah, haram, you can't do that. The hadith says you shouldn't weep like this. But it's the Prophet explained there's a difference. A fake, ostentatious beating of chest and screaming just to show people is not allowed. But when your heart moves and you cannot hold the grieving anymore, that is a show of mercy. Mercy that comes from the most merciful. And the Prophet ﷺ himself did that. This is why it's so important that we learn the Seerah, but we also learn that we have scholars who can see the subtle differences and can understand and explain why one thing is okay, but something seemingly, the same thing's happening, but it's not okay in another instance. I read one reason why Tabuk was so important, but there is another big importance here. Tabuk showed all the Arab tribes and all the other kingdoms and all the powers in the region that the Muslims were not just a bunch of tribes anymore. They were a unified people, and they had sovereignty in their own right. That means that diplomacy with the Muslims started happening. The Prophet ﷺ started, at this time, the Prophet ﷺ started receiving many, many delegations. In the last couple of years, they say he had about 70 delegations from different kingdoms, from different tribes, and from different religions. And we'll get to this interesting point. Anyway, notable amongst some of the delegations was a poet by the name of Khab ibn Zuhair. He was famous, he was a celebrity. He was a celebrity of that. He was considered to be the best poet amongst the Arabs at that time. He, however, was against the Prophet initially. He used to write poetry against the Prophet. And when he came, all the Sahaba got quite angry with him. But the Prophet said, no, show him mercy because he's come to embrace Islam. And he did accept Islam afterwards. So this celebrity has now become Muslim. The people of Taif, you know how they're still holding out? They send a delegation. And they say something. They say, we will accept Islam on 2 conditions. First condition, we don't have to do the daily prayers. We're not praying the 5 prayers. So if you agree to that, we'll accept Islam. Second condition, that we get to keep our idol, Allat, for 3 more years in our homes. Do you see the thinking of these people? It does, for us, we laugh. It doesn't make sense. But for them, they don't get it. And there are people that, unfortunately, nowadays who are like this. They will negotiate and bargain and try. But you can't. How do you negotiate? The Prophet ﷺ says this is ridiculous. No. Obviously, no. Not happening. The Prophet categorically rejects this. And when Taif finally surrenders, and here's him sending a message to make them get it, when Taif surrenders, the first thing he does is he sends the Sahaba to destroy the idols. The very first thing. Soon as the Taif say, we surrender, the Sahaba in through the gates and every idol is destroyed. You can see on one hand the gentleness and the mercy of the Prophet, and at the same time how stern he was and how single-minded he was in wiping out any untruths. There was a person who was hiding in Taif. Give it away. Someone who was hiding in Taif and had nowhere to go. But now when Taif surrendered, he was in big trouble. Know who this person is?
Is he one of the Quraysh leaders' sons?
No. Someone who has good reason to be scared.
Is he one of the people?
No, Ikrimah we covered, yes, last time. He's already Muslim.
That Prophet marks for revelation?
No. I accidentally almost said it if you were listening. Washi. Washi is hiding in Taif. And now that Taif has accepted Islam and the idols have been destroyed, he has nowhere to go, and he says, my only choice is to go to the Prophet ﷺ and ask for forgiveness. So Washi comes to the Prophet ﷺ in Medina and seeks forgiveness. The Sahaba are bristling. They see him and they cannot be held back. They want to kill him on sight. If you can't remember who Washi was the Abyssinian slave who was a slave of Hind, the wife of Abu Sufyan, and Hind was so angry with the Prophet ﷺ that she promised Washi and said, if you go and assassinate Hamza, the Prophet's uncle, I will free you. And so Washi went into the battle in Uhud, and was it Uhud? No. Uhud, yes. He went to the battle in Uhud, and he didn't fight anyone. He just went around the outskirts of Uhud, and all he had an eye for was Hamza. And when he saw Hamza, he speared him. And we know what Hind did after that. She came, desecrated the body, cut Hamza's liver out, and chewed on it. And to satisfy her anger towards the Prophet. This is the Washi who is now very, very scared for obvious reasons. But when he comes to the Prophet ﷺ forgives him and tells the Sahaba, do not hurt him, do not trouble him. But there is something very, very difficult that both Hind and Washi have to put up with. He says, when I'm around, don't be around me. try to stay away from it. Try to not be in my sight. And this is interesting. It's not because he's angry towards them. It's because he says, I am worried for your sake that in my heart, if I should get even a little bit of anger, Allah will punish you. And I don't want Allah to punish you. Look at can you imagine a human being like this? Really. He is telling the two people who assassinated his uncle that he loved more than anything, because he was uncle who stood up for him, assassinated him, cannibalized him, and he's saying, I'm worried that Allah will punish you guys. Can you find anyone like that alive now? I dare you to find anyone who can do that. But that punishment is immense for Washi and Hind. Imagine we are here, and imagine the Prophet ﷺ comes, but you're told you have to go to the room. You cannot see him. They lived with this agony their whole lives. When the Prophet ﷺ passes away, and we know Musaylama, the false prophet, right? And there was a battle. This is after the Prophet, so we may not cover this story unless you guys want me to continue once we finish. But anyway, there was a false prophet, and the Muslims fought the false prophet, but the person who killed the false prophet was Washi. After he does that, he comes to the grave of the Prophet and he cries and he cries and he cries and he says, Ya Rasulullah, can you look at me now? At least now can I stand before you? The pain he carried with him was for the rest of his life. So it's a very sad story. It is very sad. But this is the Washi. So he was forgiven, but he was never allowed to actually be in the line of sight of the Prophet or stay near close to him. Another thing that happens is a Christian delegation from Yemen comes to see the Prophet ﷺ. And they ask a question about Jesus, and the first day the Prophet doesn't respond, but the second day Surah Al-Imran comes, verses 59 to 60, and he uses that to respond. But the interesting thing is that there is actually a conversation that the Prophet ﷺ has with the Christians about religion. Because we're running out of time, I'm not going to get too much into it, but I have heard about saying, we shouldn't have dialogue with different religions and stuff. And it almost comes from a place of fear that if you should talk with Christians or Jews, you might just become a Christian or Jew. Personally, from my own example as being a Christian, Islam is not that weak that should you talk to a Christian, you will become Christian. It is not at all weak. There is strength in it. But I do accept, my personal opinion is there is truth in the fact that you should know your religion well before you get into deep conversations. But the Prophet ﷺ did converse with Christians. And final note, the Christians said, it's time for us to have our prayer and to do our service. Where can we pray? And the Prophet said, what? In the masjid. Go pray in the masjid. The Christians were allowed to pray and do their service in Masjid al-Nabawi. This was the Prophet, and I'm sure when you read the Seerah, you can think of many examples of people who don't behave like the Prophet now. But this was the Prophet. This is evidence based on what we have of the Prophet ﷺ and his Sunnah. Inshallah, we will stop there. Next week, for those in YouTube land and for those here, I really recommend, if you've missed any Seerah, do not miss next week's Seerah, because that is where we will cover his farewell to the Sahaba, but to us as well. And the last message is always one of the most important messages that he left for us. So do not miss that if you can. Inshallah. Assalamu alaikum, everyone.